Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. Our second show today. We had the wonderful Alex Churchill on earlier talking about how to be a historian. But anyway, today's subject is a different one. We are always fascinated by spies and double agents. Charles Dick Ellis was an Australian veteran of First World War and an intelligence officer. He was an associate of people like Dusko Popov, who we talked about on the channel, William Donovan, Kim Philby. But on whose side was he really on? To tackle that question is Jesse Fink, with biographies of cartel bosses and rock stars behind him. His latest book, The Eagle in the Mirror, is in the links below. Here's my copy there. You can buy it at your favorite bookstore, or you can follow the links there. But I'll bring him in now. Good evening. How are you today?
G'day, mate. Very well.
So, first-time guest, I always ask people, how do you define yourself? Biographer, historian, researcher, journalist? What label do you like to go by?
Author.
Author.
Yeah. I mean, I've done. I've done. I was a sports journalist. I've written a memoir about myself. Obviously, my third book was about the young brothers of AC/DC. My fourth was about Bon Scott of AC/DC. Then I ended up writing about drug cartels, and now I'm writing about spies.
Well, pretty broad sweep there. So, before we get into the subject of who this guy was, which is you explore at great length in this really fantastic book, but is the writing process, the research process different? I mean, because clearly if you write about AC/DC, you must like metal music and rock music. So, but writing about a guy who may or may not have been a double agent, triple agent, traitor, spy, hero, is the process different, or is it just about trying to search for the truth?
Yeah, it was completely different because really there was no one to interview. Everyone was dead. And obviously that's a challenge faced by anyone who's sort of tackling history, is that, most of your research is in archives. It's going through old books and documents and newspapers. But I learned a lot from writing, my biographies of Louis Navia, the drug trafficker, and Bon Scott, the AC/DC singer, in that I became very good at sort of locating things on the internet that would be very difficult to find, and you would often find very valuable things like in old magazines that were selling on eBay or something, and the thing is, you learn basically to use everything at your disposal, and eventually it starts coming together. But the initial process is actually extremely difficult because you have a vague idea of where you want to go with it, but it really depends on the information that you can find, and you never really know when you first start.
Yeah, as we've talked about on this channel before, and all of these people who are involved in this, I don't know whether to call it a world, a slice of society, but these agents, these people that were involved with these organizations, they tended by definition to be fast and loose with the truth. They invented different kind of personalities depending on who they were talking to. There was that whole plethora of biographies and autobiographies that came out in the Ian Fleming era, people like Popov and others. They're all competing with each other, all trying to sound like James Bond in a sense. But this guy is interesting because he's not from those same circles. So many of these kind of people are very, very British, very English, I would say, very from a certain class. This guy is Australian for a start. So let's start with giving me a kind of a thumbnail sketch of just who this guy is and where he came from and in his early years.
Well, he was born in 1895 in Sydney, Australia, and sort of didn't end up in England until 1914, when he enlisted in the British Army. He went to the Western Front. He was injured multiple times. Didn't have a very good time, I believe, in the First World War, but was quite a decorated soldier. And while he was serving as a soldier in Britain, he started learning Russian. He had a great facility for languages, and I believe he spoke about 7 or 8 languages. So he was obviously useful to the British intelligence apparatus that was developing at that time, and was sent out to Russia, Transcaspia, he got his first job with what became MI6 in Constantinople in the early 20s. Then he ends up in Berlin, Vienna, Geneva. His job is to sort of target white Russians against the Bolshevik menace, and his whereabouts and his movements is sort of around the late 20s, early 30s, late 30s. It was very difficult for me to actually kind of sort of pinpoint. But he was a fascinating guy. He worked as a journalist for the Morning Post. He wrote a book about the League of Nations, which is still regarded to this day as one of the most sort of important books on the League of Nations. And then he ends up in New York, working as the deputy of William Stevenson at British Security Coordination, which was this MI6 agency that essentially had been set up to bring the Americans into the war. And he was there. You mentioned Popov. He was there with Popov when Popov met the FBI in New York with the information about Pearl Harbor. And the interesting thing was that, of all the things that Dick Ellis ever wrote about himself, he never mentioned Pearl Harbor. But I found a Canadian TV documentary that had never aired where he was actually interviewed, and it was the only sort of live footage of Ellis that I'd ever seen, where he actually said, we got that warning to President Roosevelt. So I know that you've touched on Pearl Harbor and what Roosevelt
did. A few times, yeah.
Yeah, but I've actually got, Ellis saying that a message was sent to the president, and, whether he sort of took action on that or ignored it is unknown. But Ellis is saying, that the American president was warned. So I was staggered when I found that. And getting back to Ellis, he not only was sort of pivotal in setting up the OSS for the Americans, for which he received the Legion of Merit from President Truman. He went and set up the Australian spy service in the late 40s, early 50s. He was still actively sort of involved with MI6 really up until the sort of the late 1960s. So he was really one of the longest serving intelligence agents that Britain ever had. And he died in 1975 in Eastbourne in England, under a cloud of suspicion, really, because in the wake of Kim Philby's defection in 1963, Ellis had been hauled into an interrogation in London, where he supposedly partially confessed to having passed information on to the Nazis prior to the Second World War. And he was also accused of being a Soviet spy, but no evidence was ever sort of produced that Ellis had really been a spy for the Soviet Union. And beyond what he supposedly confessed to his superiors in 1965 in London, we don't really know anything about what he was up to with the Nazis. But that didn't stop, writers like Chapman, Pincher, Peter Wright, Nigel West in the 1980s, writing these books where basically the character of Dick Ellis was completely assassinated. And what tends to happen is that, you hear these stories and then they sort of build into myths, and then sort of other layers of bullshit are added to it. And suddenly, Ellis is responsible for everything that went wrong, in the Allied war effort. And I was sort of amazed when my father actually sort of mentioned Ellis, because I'd never heard of him. This was sort of during the pandemic. I was looking to write another book after the drug trafficking book, and he said, look into Dick Ellis, and I went to Wikipedia. There wasn't much on him at all, and but I could see that, you know, the sweep of the Ellis story was really fascinating, and he was completely unknown. So really, I just thought this is a great story that's going to have a lot of traction in, you know, the UK, the US, Australia. It's a perfect kind of subject for me. I enjoyed the research, and it was a challenge.
So let's go. Thank you for that. Let's go back to the idea that, of course, to be a triple agent, double agent, whatever you want to call it, you've got to define, in a sense, goodies and baddies. Now, up until 1918, the Russians are on the side of the Allied. Then 1919 revolution happens, that falls into question, and then the 20s is a different era again, because the Allies, the kind of the Western, are sort of friendly with Germany, and then the war starts. So to define who you're working for, you've got to be specific about which era you're talking about, because at times MI6 are wanting relationships with certain countries, and then maybe a month later they don't want the relationship, or they're at war with that country. So so that's the complicated thing. People already started saying, you know, he was a triple agent, you know, but that's a very binary way of describing someone who, as I said, the nuances of what you are if you're working for MI6 are very complicated. So how did you kind of attempt to kind of unravel this and put a label on this on Ellis?
Well, I mean, ultimately, it was just really just painstaking research using the National Archives in London. And the great thing was that during the pandemic, and I was living in Sydney, Australia, and the archives actually made the files, the MI5 files, free, so I could download hundreds of files of you know, people who were related to the story, and it didn't cost me a cent. So, you know, something that would have cost me thousands of pounds suddenly was free. But I had all this time to start really kind of going through these files and sort of just picking out things that were interesting, or that were clues that, you know, about Ellis. And literally it was a case of just sort of like, you know, a sentence at a time, putting together a very rough profile of who this person might be, where he was, constructing a timeline. None of that work had ever been done. So, you know, like, I literally put together a timeline myself. I had to sort of familiarize myself with, you know, German sort of Nazi terminology and Soviet terminology, and sort of spycraft terminology. And it was a real learning curve for me. But what I discovered in a number of files from MI5 was that, you know, Ellis was really getting around Europe, and he was obviously a very important agent to MI6, and I believe that he was involved in a sort of a complicated intelligence game, really, with sort of with the Nazis, with the Germans, with white Russians who were sort of working as double agents, and it was all about essentially their common enemy, which was at the time the Soviet Union. And this has been sort of corroborated by a number of other historians who, you know, I found were essentially coming to the same conclusion, that Ellis's facility for the Russian language, the fact that he was married to a white Russian himself, that he, you know, had a brother-in-law who was sort of deeply enmeshed in the white Russian community in Berlin and Paris, made him a very useful contact for MI6, and that he was essentially doing a bit of horse trading, you know, providing sort of chicken feed, seeing what, you know, he could get out of the other side, and that maybe in the wake of you know, Philby's defection in 1963, when MI6 was frantic, it was like, how the fuck did this happen? I don't know if I'm allowed to swear, but, you know, you're allowed
to swear. Absolutely, fucking hell, yes.
How the fuck did this happen? You know, they suddenly went back over all the files and there was a file from a Nazi officer in 1946 where he mentioned that, you know, his source was a Captain Ellis, right? And suddenly, boom, boom, you know, we've got another mole. And I think this is essentially what happened, is that, you know, Ellis was hauled in for an interrogation, asked to explain, you know, why his name is popping up in, you know, these interrogations of Nazis and of agents who were working for the Nazis, and, you know, what's his explanation for all this? And essentially, I think he fell on his sword to protect his superiors, because he was involved in something that obviously nobody was supposed to know about. And I think in the context of the 1960s, the fact that, you know, that there were British agents sort of actively kind of cooperating with sort of elements of the Nazi regime at the time, wasn't very good optics.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I want to take you back to 1963, because 63 is part of the Kim Philby story, but it's also when his own memoir comes out, and he talks about that time he spent in Russia in 18 and 19, and you know, the Malleson report I'm going to refer to now. So where do you think any doubts began to kind of establish themselves in Britain about his loyalties? I mean, because as you say, that if you're trying to get information from other people, you've got to share some information with them to gain trust. You have to kind of show willing and show your own. So this is, you know, the painting of the internet. So we remind us of what this painting is showing, and how and what Ellis's role was with this.
Well, Ellis went out to Transcaspia, what is now Turkmenistan, in 1918, 1919, and there was a massacre of what we call the 26 commissars, which is immortalized in this painting that you see. And Ellis was reputedly one of the British officers sort of in that painting, and so this myth developed that he was actually there, that he was a party to this massacre, and he was culpable for what happened. And there was another man called Reginald Teague Jones, who was also supposedly in that painting, who actually went into hiding after that, because he suddenly became sort of Stalin's number one enemy. And you know, the funny thing was that Teague Jones actually sort of started working for Ellis when he was in New York in the 1940s as an agent for British security coordination, which kind of defeats the idea of, you know, Ellis being a Soviet agent, because if he were a Soviet agent, why wouldn't he hand in his best mate to Stalin? Just years after, you know, Walter Krivitsky, the top Russian spy, was assassinated by, you know, the KGB in the United States. So it doesn't make any sense at all. You know, Teague Jones, you know, lived a normal life, and Ellis never turned him in. So I think the circumstantial case against Ellis, you know, being a Soviet spy, is incredibly weak, and I've not seen anything in all my research to suggest that he ever worked for the Soviet Union. And in fact, to the end of his life, he was very active in his sort of writings and publishing pamphlets about communism and why it was bad, and it's unfortunate that I think that writers who were out to kind of, you know, sell books, to sell books in the 1980s and make a lot of money, like Chapman Pincher, who went on to make millions with his books, and Peter Wright, who with the global bestseller Spycatcher, were quite happy to kind of tread on the reputation of a dead man who couldn't defend himself. Of course,
it seems to me that era of those books coming out is that they were building the case of their hero, whoever it would be. But in order to build their case of whoever they were writing about, they had to downplay someone else's role, make someone else a villain, so that you know, their character becomes the Obi-Wan Kenobi, the other character becomes the Darth Vader, so to speak. So that era was rife for that type of thing going on. But we're getting some questions coming in there about you know, you just said about he was still writing about, and you know, the dangers of communism late in his life. But do we know what his own political leanings were? Because that's what Gary August is asking. And then to accompany that question, we've got the question about, you know, I guess you have to be somewhat of an opportunist to get somewhere with the entire give and take it entails in the political intelligence landscape of that time. And everybody we've talked about in this kind of field, there's usually that element of personal ambition, be it wealth, be it fame, be it just to be considered good at what you do. Does he fulfill that kind of criteria for you? Is he personally ambitious, do you think? Because I'm not sure that I see that in what you've written about him.
Yeah, I think he was incredibly ambitious because he came from nothing. He literally came from nothing. His mother died when he was like, you know, 2 years old. His father was broke. They were living in a boarding house in Melbourne. He was shuttled around, you know, farms in rural Australia when he was a kid. So he had this really, you know, peripatetic sort of existence and a very poor education. And it really wasn't until, you know, he went off to London. And by the way, I should point out that he was a trained classical musician in Melbourne. He played in orchestras. So he was really self-educated. He was just an ambitious person because he just was born with nothing. And then he ends up in the UK. He goes to the front. He finds that he's very good with languages. He goes to Oxford University, where he studies Russian. He's there very briefly when he's recruited by MI6. And, you know, so of course I went to the archivist at St Edmund Hall in Oxford to find out what was going on, you know, how long Ellis was there. And he was really only there for the better part of, you know, 1 year. And then he's out in Turkey, working for MI6, and that's around sort of 1921, 1922. So to think that he went through, you know, to the end of the 60s or the early 70s, you know, as a sort of a key asset of British intelligence is quite extraordinary. And what I find more extraordinary is that, you know, no one really knows who he is. No one's even heard his name. But he's sort of involved in not only, you know, the highest levels of MI6, but he creates the CIA and he creates sort of ASIO-ACIS. And he's, you know, a war hero in 2 world wars.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary. And your book kind of serves as almost like a court case, in that you bring on your surprise witnesses, all of whom are incredible personalities. I mean, everybody involved in any kind of espionage activity from like 1930 to 1970 passes through the Ellis story at some point. So he's got his clear supporters, and yet he's also got these people who believe he's the worst kind of traitor. You know, so one of the people that he's, you know, William Donovan, I mentioned at the beginning there. He where does he fit into the Ellis story in terms of giving us an idea of Ellis's true motivations and real intentions?
Well, Ellis was, as I said, you know, Ellis went to New York to deputise for William Stevenson, but he essentially was running the OSS, or the very early version of the OSS, which is the COI, for Donovan. So it was actually Ellis who wrote the blueprint for what would become the CIA. He set up training centres for OSS personnel in Washington. So he was absolutely instrumental in you know, what became the CIA, and I was very surprised. Certainly when I went to the OSS Society to see what had been written about Ellis, there was absolutely nothing, and which was concerning. And I'm thinking, well, is that because of what was written in the 1980s about Ellis, and in these books by West, Pincher, and Wright? And I methodically kind of went through every line of Spycatcher to kind of try to corroborate what Wright was saying about Ellis, and I didn't think any of it stood up. And I don't think much due diligence was actually done on sort of checking the accusations of Peter Wright that were made in that book. And as you probably well know, the tendency of modern media is, once something is said, very few people actually take the time to go out and sort of check whether it's true or not. It just sort of has a life of its own, and it sort of just a myth becomes just accepted truth. And at a certain point of writing this book, and trying to understand who this man was, I actually felt sort of great empathy for him and great sympathy for the way that his name had been absolutely trashed, and there was nothing that he could do about it. And in fact, his daughter was so disgusted by the way the British government had treated her father that she returned all his medals, all his, the honours that he'd received, including an OBE, a CBE, everything, to the British government.
I mean, that's the point. It's accusations, it's allegations. The declarations still stand. The allegations are essentially unproven, aren't they? And that this the idea you raised there, the show we did with Alex Churchill about the information era we're in, where there's YouTube sites aplenty, YouTube channels, blogs, anybody can say anything about anything and say I'm an expert in because they've read something, and yet the reputations of war heroes can be forever left with this question mark, with this doubt. And I'll show some of the images from your book again. I mean, again, he has some pretty amazing supporters. The chiefs of MI6 were there in his corner all the way through, weren't they?
Yeah. So if it were true that he really were a Nazi Soviet spy and he had admitted to it in the 1960s, why were, Mingus and Oldfield actively his supporters to the very end? It doesn't make any sense at all. And most of the top brass of the American military intelligence apparatus were Ellis supporters as well. I think most of the allegations against Ellis and the campaign against him was driven by people who were highly embarrassed by what had happened with Kim Philby.
Yeah, and I think Kim Philby is the, in some ways, the center of this, isn't he? Because everything passes through him, and we've made the decisions about Kim Philby. The case is closed, and basically, isn't it? I mean, I think unless something new has been said in the last couple of years that I don't know about. I mean, so this is tell us about this image on the left here, because this is one of the things that was used in the kind of the trying to trash him.
Yeah. So that was reproduced in a newspaper. What was it, in 1982? And it was just taken from his book on Transcaspia, published in the 1960s. So no one even knew what he looked like. But essentially, in the early 80s, Ellis was sort of cast as, the equal or even more evil than Philby. That he was even a worse traitor than Philby. And on the basis of what? On the basis of what Peter Wright was telling Chapman Pincher, which essentially is how it started. It all started with sort of Chapman Pincher's book, Their Trade is Treachery. Then, Nigel West did his own book featuring Ellis, and then Wright, who was pissed off that Pincher had made so much money from Their Trade is Treachery, with Wright sort of supplying him all the information, and he went and wrote Spycatcher, and then Peter Wright went on and made $5 million or whatever from Spycatcher. So there was money to be made in sort of putting all this stuff out there. And of course, Ellis couldn't defend himself at all. But this, this whole thing with Philby, it all started because, a report had sort of crossed Philby's desk wherein Ellis was mentioned, and he sort of, marked in the margin, who is this man Ellis, NFA, meaning no further action. And people were looking at that thinking, oh, that's a bit odd, because Ellis and Philby worked together. But that's one way of kind of, looking at what Philby did and thinking, okay, there were sinister intentions there. There were nefarious intentions, but it could have been something else altogether, such as, he didn't want other people knowing what Ellis was up to on the orders of Mingus, Stuart Menzies. So it was all down to interpretation ultimately in the end. And I think, my feeling is that there were people within sort of American intelligence and British intelligence in the 1960s who were so embarrassed by having been fooled by Kim Philby that they wanted to sort of nail Dick Ellis, because there was supposedly another super mole called Ellie, which is, very similar to Ellis's surname, who was supposedly this, Russian super spy that no one could figure out who it was, and Ellis, of course, was mentioned in connection with Ellie. And so here you've got, pictures of ASIO setting out people to photograph an elderly Dick Ellis on his return to Sydney. He's off to, the supermarket in Bondi Junction and getting photographed by these bloody useless agents who couldn't produce anything against him.
I mean, to play sort of devil's advocate in some ways, if you sign up for any kind of intelligence agency, you kind of know that at the end of the day, your life isn't necessarily worth anything to that organization. The information, the job you're doing is worth something. But if they need to drop you to protect their own organization, and someone just made the point, Mark made the point, that post-war espionage was totally different to wartime espionage, because wartime espionage has got that real sense of goodies and baddies. And if you're going out on a spy mission in 1943, you're clearly there. The nation is at war. That's the reason there. But in the 50s and 60s, it gets, as you say, it gets very murky, because former Third Reich officials are being used all around the world in various capacities. We're playing this weird chess game with the Soviets, and the Chinese are involved. And so when someone like Ellis ends up being accused of something, it's not like MI6 are going to suddenly come out and say, well, come on and look at all of our archives. Come and say, we're an open house. We've got nothing to hide. Because of course they've got something to hide, because that's what their job is. Their job is security. Their job is intelligence. So it's sad that someone ends up being a scapegoat. But I suppose if you go into that profession, are you going to expect, does the real James Bond expect to get a pension and live somewhere, or does he expect to kind of die young because that's the job you're in? I don't know.
Yeah, well, the question of whether Ellis received a pension was also a very interesting one, because there are multiple accounts of him not getting a pension, and there are accounts of him getting a pension, but seems to be no dispute that he was actually invited to come into MI6 and sort of weed the files there for the organization in the mid 1960s. Now, is this the sort of treatment you would expect to be given to someone who was accused of being the greatest spy of the 20th century? That the bosses of MI6 said, hey, come in and, hey, you've got free access to all our files, throw out what you don't need. It doesn't make any sense. So, Ellis was still enjoying the confidence of the top brass at MI6 into the late 60s and early 70s up to his death. And, there were people from MI6, including Maurice Oldfield at his funeral in 1975. So I think if there was any real evidence that Ellis was a bad guy, they wouldn't have been there in the first place.
No, very good point. And I think I want to kind of move things towards, again, your process of writing this, because I say you've come from this background of not pure kind of military espionage research. You've researched other subjects, and it's that, as you said yourself, these books that were bestsellers, they exist. They're in the ether. They're available. We're back to the subject of AI and people searching on the internet. If they search for Ellis now, what will come up first? That he, triple agent, double agent, traitor. It depends what engine you're using. But to a certain extent, these kind of figures become, and they shouldn't do, but they become public property for anybody to say whatever they want about them, because they live in this murky world. You can kind of see what you want. Does that kind of frustrate you in a sense that these people have been just hung out to dry in a way?
Yeah, I felt very angry actually about it, and I felt like this man has contributed a great deal, not only to defeating Germany in the First World War, but defeating Germany in the Second World War. Fighting communism all through the Cold War period, being a scholar of some renown on Central Asia, of writing very important book on the League of Nations, to creating what is now the CIA, to creating the Australian Intelligence Service, to being MI6's top man in America and Asia. What an extraordinary contribution the Allies in the 20th century. Would we be living in a different world if he hadn't done all that? And I think that it just goes to show how shitty most journalism is. That all it takes is someone to write something in a book, and it gets picked up by the Daily Mail or whatever, or the Independent. Someone just reproduces what someone else said, and then it just sort of becomes accepted as truth. And this is what I discovered, really, essentially, sort of going through every newspaper article that had ever been written about Dick Ellis, was that it mostly came from three people: Nigel West, Chapman Pincher, and Peter Wright. And that was all in the early 1980s. And then suddenly, Wikipedia page is created, and essentially it sort of just rehashes, the allegations that were made against him in those books. But no one has actually sort of taken the time to go and sort of, verify whether it's true or not. And, who are the people who are feeding, Nigel West and Chapman Pincher, beyond Peter Wright? What are their motives? Are they trying to cover their own asses?
Yeah.
It's very easy to scapegoat someone who's dead. And he couldn't defend himself. And I think that's why his daughter was so disgusted that, someone who had essentially given his life to Great Britain and to the United States and Australia had been treated so shabbily after his death.
I mean, just look at the physical toll on his face. That photo there from 1919 to 1927. I mean, it's worse than Sean Connery from Dr. No to Dr. Diamonds Are Forever. I mean, that clearly he's under a lot of pressure and stress, and the toll of this job is such. And so, bringing it back to this, the kind of shows we do on World War II TV. If you're researching a military history, so you're following the 9th Battalion Durham Light Infantry, you've got maps, you've got overlays, you've got war diaries, you've got eyewitness accounts. So it's possible to establish a timeline and a series of events with real 99%. You're certain that this is correct. With a subject like this, is that how sure can you be in a sense of anything being true? Because it's someone's word against someone else's word.
Yeah.
With a real lack of information about exactly who this guy is.
Yeah. Exactly.
It must have been compared to the previous books. Was it more of a challenge, less of a challenge? I mean, are you going to do something easier next time?
It was easily the most complicated thing I've ever done, and I think I probably underestimated the work involved. I spent 4 years on a biography of Bon Scott of AC/DC and investigated his death in London in 1980, and that had taken 2 years alone, just the death. And then I'd worked on Pure Narco, which was about this drug trafficker, which involved a lot of research of Spanish language sort of media and using Google Translate but this was like on another level altogether, in that I started essentially with a man called Intrepid. Ellis was barely even mentioned in that. He wrote the foreword for it. This was the mega selling book by William Stevenson, about, coincidentally, William Stevenson. There was two William Stevensons. But there really wasn't much about Ellis in anything else really, other than he had been sort of mentioned in these books by Wright, Pincher, West. There was the whole host of sort of newspaper articles, but research takes years. It is 95% of writing a book like this. You really don't know what the ending's going to be when you first start. Yeah. And I certainly had an open mind about whether he was guilty or not. But
was there a particular kind of smoking gun, so to speak, you hoped you'd find that you didn't? I mean, was there some particular avenue you were thinking, well, that if I could find that would absolutely seal this? Because at the end of the day, you can't, the last closing words of your book are kind of that it's complicated, and it's a very difficult situation. But was there one thing that you wish you'd found that you had heard of or had heard rumors of?
Well, I mean, I write at the beginning of the book that I contacted the widow of William Stevenson, the writer, about Ellis, and I said, I'd love to have access to, the letters that your late husband and Ellis wrote to each other. And she said, well, I'm not going to give you access to them until such time as you can produce Ellis's confession. So it was like, no one else has been able to produce Ellis's confession in almost 70 years. So, that's a bit of a tall order. So, yes, of course, I would love Ellis's confession, but that's never been released. Why has it never been released? What's the substance of Ellis's confession? We're only going on, what Peter Wright wrote in Spycatcher about what Ellis supposedly said, and what Chapman Pincher said in his books about what Ellis said, and Chapman Pincher's primary source was Peter Wright himself. So essentially, it's all coming from Peter Wright. Peter Wright had books to sell. Mm. He was broke and living on the bones of his ass in Tasmania. He needed money. Mm. So what were Peter Wright's motivations in writing the stuff about Dick Ellis? And as I point out in the book, a lot of the statements that Peter Wright wrote about Ellis was completely untrue.
Well, as you said, and as the book says, you went into it with an open mind. You hadn't. I mean, the worst. I'm thinking of the story of when what's his name, the American guy, was writing all those Killing Patton and Killing Jesus and Killing Kennedy books.
Bill O'Reilly.
Yeah. Is that he was going into those books with he'd made the decision before he even sat down behind the desk. He knew he wanted to find this. The Patton being assassinated in 1945 is the example that springs to my mind. There's no objectivity if you've decided already. If you sit down going, I've now got to find evidence that Patton was bumped off, that's not the way to do it. What you do is, what is the truth about this event and what can I find? And all through the book, and what you've been saying tonight is that all you are on is a journey to try and understand, try and find the truth, and then draw some conclusions. So as we bring things to an end, what's your kind of final statement? If you were asked to be a witness, if Ellis was brought back now and put on trial and you were called as a witness, what would your opening or closing statement would be?
Oh, he was a fine man. He was a great asset to Western intelligence in the 20th century. He was a soldier to the end. He was obviously incredibly loyal to the people that he worked with. War is a complicated thing, and I imagine working as an intelligence agent. around the time of war involved some sort of fairly sort of complicated kind of moral decisions. And I don't think we should sort of judge Dick Ellis for what he did or might have done, sort of, with the sort of the morality that we have today. It's a different time. We don't know how we would act in a time of war. And I think ultimately, as I said before, I think he was involved in some sort of dark operation on behalf of his boss at MI6, and he was confronted about it in the 1960s, and he took the fall for his boss, who only died 3 years after his confession. So I imagine that he didn't want to get his boss involved in this interrogation. So there were people, in British intelligence who wanted to nail Dick Ellis.
Yeah. And Gary August is a regular viewer. He's saying that because he has a lot of knowledge about this case and put Popoff, and Scott Grimwood is in the chat. He did a show for me about Popoff. Gary is saying, has addressed my doubts. Great presentation. I think, going back to how criminal law works, you don't have to be found innocent. You only have to prove not guilty. And I think this is the interesting thing, is that it seems to me that Dick Ellis, we can't necessarily say he's innocent, but we can say he's not guilty. If there is a distinction, isn't there?
That's well put. But I just would say that I think any of us who were in that situation where we had to kind of, play a sort of a double game, a triple game, or a quadruple game with, competing interests to try and find out what the hell is going on, it's going to involve perhaps some kind of dubious moral decisions at a certain point, and maybe money was exchanged, and maybe he took some money. But would we do that in that situation? Yeah, quite possibly.
That's a very good way of bringing this to sort of close, because again, comparing this to military history, if a soldier is there in his battalion running up a hill towards the enemy, it's quite clear what the motivation is. There's no moral ambiguity there in a sense. But as you said, being involved in the spy game over whatever it was, 6 decades or something crazy, with an ever-changing enemy and deals being done behind the scenes, and you've got to balance all these things. The mental gymnastics that anyone like this has to get involved in, remember what they say about one thing to one person, what they say to someone else, keeping all that information in your head. You can't write it all down. You have to have an extraordinary intellect to do that. Yet at the same time, one little slip up, one slightly daft decision because the situation is changing behind the scenes, and you're forever left with this question mark over what you're doing. I mean, I can only have respect for anybody who goes into this profession, despite the fact it's a dodgy profession. If that doesn't sound like a paradox.
The other thing, worth pointing out is Dick Ellis had plenty of opportunities to write about his life and what was actually going on, but he resisted, that temptation. Even though he could have made a lot of money at various points, writing his memoir, he stuck to the Official Secrets Act. He didn't sort of blab.
And he didn't change his name. He didn't go and try and hide somewhere. He didn't, grow a fake moustache and live somewhere. He was living openly. He did, he was remaining had dignity by not. He could have said more, but he didn't. What an extraordinary figure.
To his detriment, ultimately, but that was the decision he made at the time, and he was a great soldier until the end. He was very loyal to the people that he worked for, and I think that his treatment has been absolutely disgusting.
Yeah, well, final word from you is what are your hopes for the book? Obviously, people who've read about this to read this and go into it with an open mind, but any other particular aim you'd like for this?
Yeah, well, it's a very sort of dense, tangled tale. It doesn't sort of lend itself easily to a Netflix adaptation or anything like that. It's not like a Band of Brothers or anything like that. But, I think he is a significant figure of the 20th century that hasn't got his due really until this book, and I hope that other journalists sort of pick up the Ellis story and kind of just look at it and think, he actually contributed a great deal to the peace and security that we enjoy today. And he should never have been treated the way that he was treated.
That's very good words to end it with. And again, just to echo off that, some dodgy things have to be done behind the scenes to keep our country safe. And I'm glad that those things are happening, and I don't have to be involved in them. And it's I'm not going to say the world is a peaceful place, because a lot of it isn't, but there are people doing things, I would like to think, for the benefit of everybody. And he's, for my money, he's one of those people. And hats off to him. And so Jesse, it's been fantastic talking to you. I hope our paths cross again in the future when you've written something else. But in the meantime, thanks for joining us. So again, folks, don't forget, I'll hold up the book there. Buy it at whatever shop you use, or there's the link there below. But meantime, I'm going to say thank you very much for joining us. Thank everybody for your questions. We didn't get to all of them, but hey, there's things we didn't. But cheers, everybody. I will see you 2 more shows again tomorrow. No, yeah, 2 more shows tomorrow afternoon. And thanks in the meantime for watching. This is Paul Woodard for World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your day. Cheers, everybody. Bye.